Let's bring the beach alive through these 4 paintings as I share my best tips on how to paint them. First, let's grab all of our supplies. I'm using the Lucas 1862 watercolors, white gouache from the Holbein brand, a white gel pen, and I'm using 100% cotton watercolor paper in the block form. And I'm using a watercolor block because I'm going to be using a lot of water and I don't want the paper to warp. When paper is in a block, it's actually glued on all 4 sides except for a small gap. So I'm going to use this envelope opener to peel off the page at the very end. For brushes, I'm using the round shape sizes 2, and I have 2 brushes in the size 10. I'll need a spray bottle with water to keep my paints wet, a larger jar of water, and some paper towel. Let's get started. I'm starting out with the spray bottle and wetting the paints. And with my paper, I've divided it into 4 sections because I'm going to paint 4 beach landscapes. I'm preparing the yellow ochre light, gold ochre, and Naples yellow. I'm using my round size 10 brush. And for this painting, I'm going to start with the wet on wet. So I'm pre-wetting my paper and then adding a light value of the yellow ochre light. One of the tips that I would suggest when painting landscapes especially, play around with the wet on wet versus wet on dry. Some people prefer to work exclusively in wet on dry, and some like to do wet on wet first. As for me, when it comes to landscapes, I do like to start with the wet on wet first so that I can quickly spread out the color, and then I can always layer with the wet on dry later. Next, let's prepare the watercolors for the top 2 paintings. I'm using the indigo, turquoise, chromium oxide green, and permanent blue. I love how these colors from Lucas are so creamy. I don't have to really rub my brush in as much, and I can easily pick up colors. Again, I'm starting with the wet on wet, and I'm being very spontaneous about how I'm laying down the colors. Notice how I dip my green into the blue for a deeper turquoise color. I'm very liberal about how I'm spreading the paint. Don't worry if there's a lot of overlap between the water and the sandy area. A lot of that is going to be covered by the white gouache later. When it comes to the corners, you do want to darken those a little bit. So as long as the paper is still wet, drop in some more paint. For the second painting, I'm going to start with the wet on dry technique. So notice how I first laid down the color, and then I used a medium wet brush to draw out that color and blend it out. I also added some raw umber to the sandy area. And now let's go on to the water. Again, I'm starting with the wet on dry, so I'm just laying down the color and then quickly washing out my brush so that there's still a little bit of pigment, but mostly water. And I'm going to use a very wet brush to draw out that color, blend it out, and keep adding more colors for the ocean. When I do a variegated wash like this, sometimes I like to start the color on one end and then start another color on the other end, and then bring them together in the middle and blend. You do want to work quickly, otherwise you'll get some pretty harsh lines forming. But because this is supposed to mimic the water, a couple hard lines here and there is not a big deal. Since I did the wet on dry technique, the top part of my painting has already dried. So I'm going in there with a second layer and adding some more yellow ochre. And since my first painting is kind of dry, I'm going to do a second layer there as well. So this is where the second brush comes in. If I'm going to use the same color over and over again, or if I don't want to wash that brush out, then I grab a second clean brush that has a similar size. In this case, I have both round 10 brushes. That's great. But what I do with the first brush that has the paint color is I lay down the color, and then with the second brush, which is mostly clean and mostly dry, I fade out that color. And I'll wash out that second brush every once in a while because I don't want the colors to start mixing too much together. This really helps me control where the paint goes and also control the value of the painting. I noticed on the second painting that a water droplet fell and then created this cauliflower bloom. And that might happen, and that's okay, but it just looked a little odd and out of place. So I'm just going in there with another layer and trying to cover that up. I really like how these two paintings are coming together, and I'm going to work a little bit more on deepening the corners in the ocean layer. Again, lay down that color with the first brush and then use the second brush to fade it out. Whenever you layer, you want to make sure that your paint is not very watery. And even with that second brush, you want to use very little water. The brush should still be wet, but just damp enough to move the paint. The bottom two paintings are going to be slightly more muted in color, and the water is going to be more green than blue. Let's first prepare the colors. I've got burnt umber, some raw umber, and that's going to be the basis of the beach. I'm starting out with a really wet brush and a light value of that raw umber color. And like I said, the water is going to be more green than the top two paintings. So I'm starting out with a really wet mixture of the paints. And I'm using the reference photo for guidance, but I'm also just allowing the colors to mix spontaneously and move as they will, and just kind of going with the flow, literally. I'm adding some of that deep indigo color to establish some of the wave forms. And to darken that corner. The last painting is going to have a larger beach area, so I'm starting with that raw umber color again and covering about 3/4 of the space with this color. I'm fading it out nicely with a lot of water, and as you know with watercolors, because they're transparent, you can always build up to darker colors, but it's going to be really hard to take away colors, so just keep that in mind. Using 100% cotton paper makes it really easy to use the wet on wet technique. It's able to hold a lot more water and paint and not let it soak into the lowest layers automatically. So you're able to manipulate the paint a little bit more before it starts sinking in and staining the paper. As I was painting this, I realized maybe I can add some aerial views of umbrellas in the beach area at the bottom. So I'm going to do that towards the end. As you work on this, you might see harsh lines or see areas that need darker values. So just be observant and be mindful of how wet your paper is and how dry it is, and use your discretion. Trust your instincts. Again, I'm using the two brush method where I'm just fading out the color. As you fade out this color, you might also notice that if your brush is really dry, you're basically doing the dry brush technique. And for a landscape like this, I think the dry brush technique is actually spot on. So even if you get streaky lines and you're able to see the texture of the paper, that might actually work to your advantage. And later, when we use the white gouache, we're actually going to use the dry brush technique very heavily. So it might be a good idea to even practice that right now. All right, now it's time for the gouache. So I actually have a giant tube of white gouache, and I have the Stay Wet palette that I've been using in my live streams. So I'm just going to squeeze a tiny dollop. I've now switched to my round size 2 brush. And starting with the top left painting, I'm starting at the shoreline and just roughly dotting along the shoreline. You want to make sure not to water down the gouache too much because you want it to stay as opaque as possible. This first painting is not going to have such crazy waves, so most of the white is going to be right at the shoreline. If you pick up just a little bit of white at a time and start turning your brush, you might notice that you're using the dry brush technique and you're seeing the texture of the paper showing through. One of the things you want to do as you're putting down the white is also adding contrast right around it. So I'm going back to the Naples yellow and grabbing that with my size 2 brush and painting right along that white gouache line. I'm also using the dry brush technique to just roughly spread out that paint and give it that sandy texture. In the reference photo, there are also some rocky areas, so I'm dotting loosely with my round size 2 brush in the burnt umber color. Now let's move on to the second one. Again, I'm starting at the shoreline, but this one is going to have a lot more waves. So start roughly by just creating some dotted and dashed lines along the shoreline, and then create the next wave and the next. And again, use your reference photo as a guide and try to use as much of the dry brush technique to fill in the gaps and really show that texture of the foam. All right, the first layer of the foam have been established. So I'm going back into the ocean area and adding some of that contrast like we did in the first one, but with the sand. So I'm using that dark indigo plus chromium oxide green color. And again, just fading it out with the dry brush technique and being very rough with it. Don't forget to add the contrast even within the waves and just go with your instincts. You don't have to add it in every gap you see, but add just enough so that you see that contrast. I decided to use the white gel pen just for this painting because in the reference photo, in the sandy area, there are lots of tiny little streaks of white. So that was kind of hard to do with my brush. So I felt like the pen would do a much better job. I'm going to speed up the painting process for the third and fourth paintings just for the sake of time, but you can see that I'm going to continue to use the same principles of adding white gouache along the shoreline and the waves, and then using the dry brush technique. I'll also be adding a lot of color within the white gouache to make the waves look foamy. So sit back, relax, and practice makes progress. In order to remove the sheet, find the gap where there's no glue. Take your envelope cutter, stick it through that gap, and then just gently push along the edge to free that page. I like to use an envelope cutter because it's not sharp, but some blocks can be really difficult. So just use your discretion. And there you go. I love how these turned out. If you followed along with these tips, I'd love to see your work. Please tag me at Audrey Raw Design and use the hashtag #PaintWithAudrey. I can't wait to see what you create. Please subscribe to my channel for more tutorials, like this video, and comment below to tell me something that you learned, or let me know of your favorite beach location. I'll see you next time.